From high above Earth's stratosphere, Kivani's transport capsule looked more like a falling star than a vessel of advanced alien technology. Its surface shimmered as atmospheric friction burned against the alloy, turning the capsule into a streak of light that vanished into the darkness of a rural night. Inside, Kivani sat in silence, her six-fingered hands clasped tightly around the glowing orb that guided her descent. She felt the shudder of atmospheric entry, the jolt of the capsule's stabilizers engaging, and finally the low hum as the craft slowed and hovered just above the ground. A gentle thud marked her arrival. The capsule's outer shell folded away, retracting into itself until nothing but smooth ground remained where it had landed. Kivani stood, her silvery skin catching the faint glow of moonlight, and her crystalline eyes scanning the surroundings. A field of tall grass stretched around, bordered by a thin line of trees that swayed softly in the night breeze. Stars winked in the sky above, and the air smelled unfamiliar, rich and earthy, tinged with the faint chemical notes of human industry. Her instructors had warned her not to linger in open spaces. Observe, record, and withdraw, they'd told her. Minimize interaction until you understand their behavior. But Kivani couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. She wanted to see this world up close, to feel it under her bare feet, to hear the sounds that filled its air. She stepped cautiously through the field, her senses drinking in the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, and the distant murmur of water flowing somewhere beyond the trees. She followed the sounds until she reached the edge of a small village. The buildings were modest, quaint wooden structures with sloping roofs and narrow windows that glimmered with warm, flickering light. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint scent of cooking food drifted toward her. For a moment, Kivani hesitated. This was her first glimpse of human civilization, and it felt both alien and oddly familiar. The village reminded her of the small communal dwellings her people had lived in generations ago, before their technology had transformed. Their way of life. Kivani adjusted the translator coil embedded behind her ear. If she had to speak, the device would render her words intelligible to these humans, but she doubted she would need it tonight. Her plan was simple: observe quietly from a distance, gather data, and leave before anyone noticed her. As she crept closer, she stepped on a loose stone, which shifted noisily underfoot. A sharp crack echoed through the quiet night. The sound was faint but enough to alert a nearby figure. A man in a heavy coat turned, squinting into the darkness. His eyes fell on her, and his expression changed from confusion to alarm. He shouted something, words she couldn't yet understand. Within seconds, other lights flickered on in nearby houses. More figures emerged, their voices rising in a mix of alarm and anger. Kivani's crystalline eyes reflected the growing glow of lanterns and flashlights as the villagers surrounded her. They pointed and shouted, some gesturing wildly, while others held crude tools, hammers, shovels, even a hunting rifle. Her translator began parsing their words. "What is that thing? Where did it come from? Is it dangerous? Call the sheriff." She raised her hands slowly, a gesture meant to convey that she meant no harm. "I am a traveler," she said softly. Her voice emerged through the translator as a calm, measured tone. "I mean you no harm. I only wish to learn." But the humans didn't listen. One young man, emboldened by the crowd, bent down and hurled a small rock. It struck Kivani's shoulder, and while her advanced dermal plating absorbed the impact, the gesture stunned her. Others followed his lead, throwing stones and jeering. Some began shouting insults, while a few voices screamed for her to leave. The pain wasn't physical. Kivani's body was durable enough to withstand the crude projectiles, but the hostility stung. Back on her homeworld, disagreements were resolved through dialogue and consensus. Here, fear and anger ruled the moment. She took a step back, then another, curling her arms around herself as the barrage continued. Her first contact with humanity was a storm of rejection and fear. Her mission had not prepared her for this. She felt exposed, unprotected, and deeply alone. The blue and green world that had seemed so full of promise was turning out to be something else entirely. In that moment, she realized that Earth, for all its beauty, was also a place where first impressions could bring danger, and that surviving here would require far more than her training had taught her. The shouting roused Nathan Marlowe from his restless sleep. The old cabin's walls barely muffled the angry voices and the deep thuds of rocks hitting something solid. He rubbed his face, groggy and annoyed, and reached for his boots. Since he'd returned to this sleepy town, the nights had been too quiet, the days too uneventful. Now, in the middle of the night, the townsfolk had apparently found something or someone to rile them up. Nathan cinched his bootlaces, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the crisp night air. What he saw made him pause. A mob had gathered. In the town square, their lanterns casting flickering shadows across the dirt road and weathered storefronts. He couldn't make out the center of their attention at first. Then a glint of silver caught his eye. A figure crouched low, trying to shield itself from the hail of stones. Nathan's brows knit together in confusion. A girl? No, not exactly. Her silhouette was wrong, too smooth and lithe, and her skin seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the lantern light. He hesitated. Whatever she wasn't from around here. Not from this town. Not from this world, he realized. Nathan had seen strange things before. Too many late-night military missions in remote places where they didn't always explain what you were looking for. But he'd never seen anything like her. The villagers didn't notice him at first. Their voices blended into a chaotic chant. "Get out! Leave us alone! Back to where you came from!" Their anger wasn't just fear. It was fury. Something raw that he couldn't understand. Not yet. He pushed through the crowd, his presence unnoticed until he was nearly at the front. A rock zipped past his shoulder, missing him by inches. "Hey!" His shout carried over the din, sharp and commanding. "What the hell are you all doing?" The mob faltered, a wave of murmurs rippling through it. People turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of surprise and annoyance. Some backed away. His size and the hardness in his voice were enough to give them pause. Others, though, stood their ground. "She's not one of us," a man shouted, holding a pitchfork like a badge of courage. "She's a monster. She could be dangerous." Dangerous? Nathan scanned the girl again. She was trembling now, her arms wrapped around her knees. She wasn't fighting back. She wasn't even trying to run. "I don't see her throwing anything at you. I don't see her charging into the crowd. All I see is something sitting there, trying not to get hurt. She's not human," a woman cried. Nathan stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. "I don't care if she's not human. That's not an excuse to throw rocks at her like you're a pack of kids on a playground. Since when do we treat anything like this?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few murmured agreements rose, but they were drowned out by the louder voices. "What if she's a scout for an invasion?" someone yelled. "What if she's got weapons?" "If she's here to hurt us," Nathan said, his voice hard, "then she's doing a pretty damn bad job of it, isn't she? Look at her. She's scared out of her mind. You think that's an invader?" A few people in the crowd hesitated. The logic was simple, undeniable, and uncomfortable. Some lowered their stones, though their hands still hovered uncertainly. The man with the pitchfork took a step forward. "Then what do you suggest we do? Just let her wander around and spy on us? Let her get away with whatever she's here to do?" Nathan squared his shoulders. "I suggest you back off before someone gets hurt. If she's here to cause trouble, I'll deal with it. But I'm not going to stand here and watch a mob beat her down before we even know what she wants." The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse. It wasn't all at once. people broke away. In twos and threes, muttering under their breath, some glared at Nathan, their fear and anger still simmering, but no one wanted to challenge him outright. One by one, they turned back to their homes, until the square was empty, save for Nathan and the alien girl. She remained huddled on the ground, unmoving. Nathan took a step closer. "Hey," he said, quieter now. "You okay?" Her large, crystalline eyes turned up toward him. The fear in them was unmistakable, but there was something else, something like wonder. She didn't speak, only watched him as if she were trying to understand what he had just done. Nathan crouched down, lowering himself to her level. "They're gone," he said. "You're safe now. Can you stand?" She nodded slowly, her movements almost liquid, and pushed herself to her feet. Up close, Nathan could see the fine patterns, etched into her silvery skin, like the veins of a leaf or the branching lines of frost on a window pane. He'd never seen anything so strange or so beautiful. "Where are you from?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer wasn't anywhere on Earth. Her voice was soft, melodic. "Far away," she said. He exhaled and glanced at the darkened homes around them. "You can't stay here," he said. "Not after what just happened. They'll come back if they see you again." She looked around, her expression unreadable. "I don't want to cause trouble." Well, too late for that. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking, "Come with me. I've got a place outside town. You'll be safe there, at least for tonight." She hesitated, then nodded. Nathan gestured for her to follow, and together they made their way into the shadows of the forest. As they walked, Nathan couldn't help but wonder what he'd just gotten himself into. He hadn't asked for this, but now that she was here, he couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. Something about her vulnerability, her otherworldly fragility, called to a part of him he hadn't felt in years. It was the same part of him that had once driven him to protect his squadmates in the field, the part that wouldn't let him walk away when someone needed help, no matter how alien they might be. The cabin was not much to look at. Its weathered wood had turned grey with time, and the stone chimney leaned just enough to hint at disrepair. Inside, the sparse furnishings didn't suggest a long-term occupant. Nathan had barely been back, in town for a month, and he hadn't felt compelled to make the place comfortable. Now, as he shut the door behind them and lit a kerosene lamp, he realized how barren it must appear to someone who had no concept of human habitation. Kivani stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, her delicate silvery skin catching the soft glow of the lamp. She was clearly out of her element. Her large crystalline eyes shifted around the cabin's interior, scanning every object: the threadbare armchair, the shelf with a handful of old books, the kettle on the wood stove. Nathan imagined it all must look crude and primitive to someone. "From another world. You can sit," Nathan said, motioning toward the armchair. Kivani hesitated, then lowered herself gingerly onto the edge of the seat, her posture stiff. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan didn't know what to say to an alien guest who had just been attacked by his neighbors. And Kivani, for her part, seemed reluctant to break the silence. Finally, Nathan leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "So, what now? What's your plan?" Kivani looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I only wanted to observe, to understand your people and your ways. My mission was never meant to involve direct contact." "Yeah, well, that plan didn't last long," Nathan said dryly. He tilted his head, studying her. "You were alone, out there, no backup, no escape route. Why?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, which rested in her lap. "Because my people are desperate. Our homeworld is no longer habitable. We've traveled for generations, seeking a place where we can settle, where we can thrive. Earth seemed promising. And you decided to just show up unannounced, in the middle of a human town, and hope for the best?" Nathan asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Kivani looked up again, and her crystalline eyes reflected something like shame. "No, I chose this place because it seemed quiet, isolated. I thought I could study your customs unnoticed, then report back. I didn't expect them to react so violently." "People fear what they don't understand," Nathan said, his tone softening. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "And let's be honest, you showing up out of nowhere, looking the way you do, was bound to set people off. I thought humans might be more curious," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment, "more willing to learn." "Some are," Nathan replied. "But you stumbled onto a group that doesn't like surprises. Around here, folks stick to what they know, and if something doesn't fit, they'd rather get rid of it than try to figure it out." Kivani's shoulders slumped. "Then I've failed. I can't help my people if I can't even hold on," Nathan cut in, his voice firm. "You didn't fail. You just ran into a rough crowd. This isn't the whole planet, and maybe you can't fix everything overnight, but that doesn't mean you give up." Kivani studied him, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "You really believe I can find a way to understand humans, even after what happened?" Nathan pushed off the doorframe and stepped closer, pulling out one of the wooden chairs from the small kitchen table. He sat down across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not going to be easy. People don't trust what they don't know, and trust takes time. But you've got one person on your side now." She tilted her head slightly, the alien gesture reminding him just how different she was. And yet, it also reminded him how human she seemed in her vulnerability. "You?" "Yeah," Nathan said simply. "You didn't hurt anyone, and you didn't fight back, even when you could have. That tells me something about you, so I'll help you figure this out, but you're going to have to trust me too." Kivani's eyes shimmered faintly, as if catching an unseen light. "I'll try." They spent the next few hours talking in fits and starts, their conversation punctuated by long silences. Nathan asked questions: where she was from, what her people needed, why they had chosen Earth. Kivani answered carefully, revealing just enough to help him understand, but not so much as to betray her people's secrets. In turn, she asked about humans, their cultures, their languages, their history. Nathan did his best to explain, though he quickly realized how overwhelming it all must sound to someone hearing it for the first time. By the time the first faint streaks of dawn appeared at the edges of the window, they had begun to find a rhythm. Kivani wasn't just a helpless stranger anymore. She was someone with a purpose, someone whose curiosity matched his own, and Nathan wasn't just a drifter hiding from his past. He had a role now, a reason to stay, but as they fell into a tense, uneasy sleep, Nathan knew that their problems were far from solved. The town wouldn't forget about her. The fear and suspicion that had turned the mob against her still simmered, ready to boil over at the first opportunity. Nathan had made his choice, to protect her, to learn from her, but he didn't know how long he could keep the world at bay. All he knew was that for now, they were allies, and for now, that was enough. The morning brought no reprieve. Kivani awoke to the sound of faint voices, the low rumble of engines, and the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on dirt. She sat up in the dim light of Nathan's cabin, her wide, crystalline eyes darting toward the window. Nathan was already on his feet, his jaw clenched as he peered through a gap in the curtains. "They're back," he muttered. He glanced over his shoulder at Kivani. "Stay out of sight." Kivani nodded and moved away from the window, her slender, silver-toned form almost blending with the shadows inside the cabin. Nathan grabbed his jacket, slipped on his boots, and stepped outside. The chill morning air bit at his skin as he surveyed the group that had gathered on the cabin's front lawn. The mob had grown. Yesterday's angry crowd had doubled, maybe tripled. They came armed with shotguns, pitchforks, crowbars, and axes, their faces tight with anger and fear. Someone had brought a can of gasoline, another carried a coil of rope, and all of them carried the unshakable conviction that they were doing the right thing. At the center of the group stood Martin Granger, the town's self-proclaimed leader. Granger had always been loud, always quick to rally people to his cause, no matter how flimsy that cause might be. Now he wore an old hunting jacket and a grim expression as he stepped forward. "Nathan," Granger called out, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You know why we're here." Nathan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Yeah, I've got a pretty good idea." "Then you know what needs to be done." Granger's voice hardened. "Hand it over." "Her," Nathan corrected. "She's not an it. She's not an animal." Granger's face twitched. "Whatever you want to call it, it doesn't belong here. It's dangerous." "Dangerous?" "Least I checked, she's been hiding out in my cabin, not bothering anyone." "Not yet," Granger snapped. "But we can't wait until something happens. You know how these things work. They scout us out, learn our weaknesses, and before you know it, we're overrun." Nathan's gaze swept over the crowd. Most of them didn't look angry. They looked scared. He understood that fear, but he couldn't let it win. "You don't even know what she's doing here. You don't know who she is or what she wants. You're ready to kill her just because she's different. Better safe than sorry," someone shouted from the back of the mob. Nathan took a step forward, his hands at his sides. "You call yourselves brave, but this isn't bravery. Bravery is taking the time to understand. Bravery is showing kindness even when you're afraid. If you can't do that, then you're just a bunch of cowards with weapons." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shuffled their feet, their grips on their tools and weapons loosening. Others stared at Nathan with open resentment. Granger's face darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. "And what happens when it turns on us?" Granger challenged. "What happens when it brings more of its kind down here, and we're the ones left holding the bag?" Nathan's voice grew quieter, steadier. "If she was here to hurt us, don't you think she would have done it by now? She's had plenty of chances, but instead she's done nothing but run and hide. That's not the behavior of someone looking to start a war. It's the behavior of someone looking for peace." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some people lowered their weapons entirely. Granger's scowl deepened as he saw the tide starting to shift. "Don't listen to him," he barked. "He's just trying to protect his own skin. If we don't take care of this now, we're all going to regret it." Nathan stood tall, his gaze sweeping the faces before him. "You're right about one thing," he said. "If you hurt her, you will regret it. Not because she'll come after you, she won't, but because you'll have to live with what you've done. You'll have to look your kids in the eye and tell them you were so afraid that you chose hate over humanity." A heavy silence fell. The crowd shifted uneasily, and Granger's hand tightened into a fist. For a moment it seemed he might order them forward anyway. But before he could speak, an older woman in the crowd stepped back. Then another man followed, then another. One by one, people began to leave, their fear and anger fading into uncertainty and shame. Some muttered apologies under their breath as they passed Nathan. Others simply walked away in silence. Granger stood alone, his jaw clenched, tight. He looked at Nathan, then at the cabin. Finally, he shook his head and spat on the ground before turning and stalking off into the woods. Nathan waited until the last of them was gone before he let out a long breath. He turned back to the cabin and opened the door. Kivani stood just inside, her eyes wide, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had heard everything. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathan gave her a tired smile. "Don't thank me yet. They might come back. We're not out of the woods." "But for now," Kivani said, a faint, hopeful note in her voice. They listened. For now, they stopped. Nathan nodded. "Yeah, for now." He paused, then stepped closer, his expression serious. "But we can't stay here. If they come back, it'll be worse next time. We'll figure something out. Together." Kivani nodded, her silvery features softening. Together. For the first time, She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here after all.